How is everybody? I got to say, did she not just do a great job? I mean, goodness gracious. Not only great, she's a great communicator. I mean, a great communicator. I would say this, and I'm being for real. Can you imagine a man doing a better job than she just did? No, she killed it. So anyway, good morning to everyone, and thank you for being here today. And a couple of things that I want to do real quickly is I want to thank the speakers that are here for coming and sharing at this conference. And when you see them, would you please let them know how much you appreciate them, please? Let's make sure that we go out of our way to say thanks for coming. I also want to thank the worship team here at Grace Community Church for taking the time to lead us in worship. I think they've done an excellent job, and I think they're... And I also want to thank the staff of the church and the volunteers of our church for the work they've put into making this event happen. And I want to single a group out. The volunteers of our church are heroes, and I think they deserve a round of applause, the volunteers. Amen? So whether you have been a Christian for many years or are new to the faith or are still sort of exploring what you believe, I really hope that this session will be both encouraging and intellectually helpful. In Luke 24:21, the disciples that are leaving Jerusalem going to Emmaus, the Emmaus disciples, are reported as saying this, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." Why'd they say that? What'd that mean to them? They said it because the Jews of Jesus' day had Messianic expectations. They had a very specific thought process and theological beliefs concerning this. The Jews in Jesus' day, although it was not monolithic, but they did expect a Messiah. They expected a Messiah who would overthrow their oppressors, and then Israel would be the nation above all nations, so to speak. And when this happened, that's when the Gentiles would be gathered in, and the Lord would fill the earth with his glory. They cited texts like Isaiah 2, and it was a very familiar passage to the Jews of Jesus' day, very familiar to the Jews of antiquity. And this is what Isaiah wrote. The word that Isaiah, the son of Emmaus, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be lifted above all the hills, and all the nations will flow to it." They expected this to happen. They expected for Israel to be exonerated and the chains thrown off of the oppression, and in poetic language, the mountain, the kingdom of Israel rising above all the other nations, and then the nations would flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations. They will decide disputes for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." This was their expectation. They were expecting a Messiah that would come and deliver them. They were expecting for the day when the law would go forth into the world and would convert the world. It shouldn't be surprising that Jesus, in Matthew 28, went to a mountain with his disciples and said, "Now go into all of the world and make disciples." Because Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these things. He is all the promises of God are find their yes in Jesus. They had this expectation, but this expectation wasn't what they found in Jesus. And so they looked forward to this day. And many believed that it was near. It was almost a white hot moment in Jerusalem in the first century. Everybody was on their tiptoes waiting for a Messiah. And we see this in the Gospels because the crowds want to make Jesus king. The disciples want to sit on his right hand and his left hand when he comes in his glory. They don't understand the purpose of Jesus. That's why they recoil at the idea of him dying. Because here's why. The Messiah doesn't die at the hands of the Romans. He conquers them. If a would-be Messiah died, it was game over. And the Romans knew this too. So if the word got out that there was a Messianic movement somewhere going on, because they knew what Israel thought, they could easily stop that movement, easily, by just simply killing the would-be Messiah. And we have instances in history of Messianic movements before and after Jesus that the Romans put an end to. And we know this beyond a shadow of a doubt. As soon as that would-be Messiah died, it was the end of the movement. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever that any Jewish group in the first century would be continuing any movement if the would-be Messiah died. Because here's the reality. A dead Messiah was a failed Messiah. That is why the Emmaus Road disciples said what they said. They had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. But he died. So it's time to go home. What best then explains why Christianity continued? What's the most plausible explanation when we know for a fact when a would-be Messianic figure died, it was game over? Nobody said, you know what, let's get the band back together and let's write down some stuff and let's try to remember. No, they were a failure because in their world, the Messiah had certain expectations. Honestly, Christianity should have ended the day in Jerusalem when Jesus died. There's no good reason at all to suggest that any Messianic movement would have continued after the would-be Messiah died. This morning, what I want to do is I want to argue for a very specific claim, that the central claim of Christianity is not that God exists. It's not that morality is objective. It's not that miracles are possible. It's not even that the Bible is inspired. The central claim of Christianity is that Jesus Christ physically rose from the dead. And everything else stands or falls on that event. And that event is the best explanation for why we have a Christianity today. The Apostle Paul understood this clearly. In his letter to the first letter to the Corinthian church, he writes, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say Christianity becomes weaker. He doesn't say Christianity becomes less convincing. He doesn't say Christians would need to revise a few doctrines. He says faith becomes futile. In other words, if Jesus remained in the grave, Christianity is false. That's a remarkable claim. Most religions ultimately rest on some private revelations or philosophical insights or spiritual experiences or ethical teachings. Christianity's different. Christianity places its credibility on a public historical claim that a man was publicly executed, he was publicly buried, his followers claimed his tomb was later empty, they then proclaimed that he had risen from the dead, and he appeared to numerous witnesses. The Christian faith literally rises or falls on whether that actually happened. That means, listen to me, Christianity is uniquely falsifiable. Because if Jesus did not rise from the dead, Christianity should be rejected. But if he did rise from the dead, then everything changes. That means his teachings do carry divine authority. His claims about himself are vindicated. His promises become trustworthy. His death becomes the means of salvation. And history itself is divided by the most significant event that ever occurred. That's why Christian apologetics must begin with the resurrection. Arguments for God's existence are important. Arguments from morality are important. Arguments from intelligent design and fine-tuning are important. But none of those arguments identify Jesus Christ. At most, they point to a creator. The resurrection is where philosophy meets history. It's where theology meets evidence. It's where the question, does God exist, becomes the real question, did God raise Jesus from the dead? Ultimately, everything comes back to that. So what I want to do in the brief few minutes that I have is I want to demonstrate why the resurrection is not merely one doctrine among many, but it is the foundation for all Christian apologetics. And we're going to examine these things: why the resurrection is central to Christianity, the historical evidence surrounding the resurrection, why alternative explanations fail, why the resurrection transformed first century Judaism, why the resurrection validates Jesus' identity and message, why every major apologetic argument ultimately points here, what the resurrection means for us personally, and then I'm going to end with a few videos that I think will surprise you about how deeply even the resurrection is told in the Old Testament itself. This will only take us 4 hours, so get on. Just kidding. So anyway, why is the resurrection central to Christianity? Well, Christianity is fundamentally different from a philosophy. It's different from a moral system. It's different from a self-help program. The gospel's not live a better life. The gospel's not follow these spiritual principles. The gospel's not become more of a loving person. Those things may be good, but they're not the gospel. The gospel, the good news, is the announcement that something happened. Specifically, that Jesus died by crucifixion, that he was buried, that he rose bodily from the dead, he appeared to eyewitnesses, and the earliest Christians were not primarily proclaiming advice, they were proclaiming news. The New Testament repeatedly presents Christianity is rooted in real events occurring in real history. Without the resurrection, Jesus becomes another failed religious leader. The cross becomes a tragic execution. Sin remains unforgiven. Death remains undefeated. The apostles become false witnesses. The church becomes founded on a mistake. But if the resurrection happened, Jesus is who he claimed to be. His teachings then carry that divine authority. The cross becomes God's means of redemption. Death has been defeated, and Christianity is true. So the resurrection isn't sort of one doctrine among many. It's the foundation under every other doctrine that we believe. So it's central to Christianity. Let's talk about the historical case for this. And I want to say some of this will intersect with what Mike Licona did yesterday morning, who did a great job of showing us how to present the resurrection on a napkin. Can we agree? Mike did a fantastic job on that. So many people assume belief in the resurrection requires blind faith, but Christianity actually invites historical investigation. The resurrection claim emerged publicly. It originated in Jerusalem. It was proclaimed in the very city where Jesus was executed. It was proclaimed while hostile witnesses were still alive. It was proclaimed while opponents had every incentive to refute it. When discussing the resurrection historically, it's important to understand what historians can and can't do. Historians generally don't attempt to prove miracles directly. Instead, what they do is they establish historical facts, and then they ask the question, what explanation best accounts for those facts? That's exactly how we approach most events in ancient history. The question's not whether we can place the resurrection in a laboratory. The question is whether or not the resurrection best explains the evidence that we have. And several facts are accepted by not just a large number of scholars, but many who are not even Christians themselves. Fact one, Jesus died by crucifixion. This is one of the most certain facts in almost all of ancient history. It's reported in multiple independent sources. It's affirmed by Christian writers. It's affirmed by non-Christian writers. It's affirmed by Jewish and Roman sources. Virtually no historian argues that Jesus somehow survived crucifixion. Roman executioners were experts. Failure was not an option. Jesus died. That point is historically secure. Fact two, the tomb was found empty. The empty tomb is significant because even the earliest critics didn't simply point to Jesus' body. Instead, the opponents argued the disciples stole it. Notice what that argument assumes. It assumes there was no body in the tomb. The earliest dispute was never whether the tomb was empty. The dispute was how it became empty. An empty tomb by itself doesn't prove the resurrection, but it's one piece of evidence that does demand an explanation. We have fact number 3. The disciples believed that they saw the risen Jesus. After Jesus' execution, the disciples had every reason to abandon hope. Their leader had been publicly executed. Their expectations appeared shattered, yet something dramatic happened. Within a remarkably short period of time, they were publicly proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. They faced imprisonment, persecution, beatings, social rejection, and in some cases, death. People may die for something that they mistakenly believe to be true, but people don't usually willingly suffer for a lie that they know that they invented. The disciples genuinely believed they had encountered the risen Christ. The question is why? Why did they believe that? Fact 4, skeptics were converted. 2 of the most important leaders in the early church began as skeptics or opponents. James, the brother of Jesus, doesn't appear to have believed Jesus' messianic claims during his earthly ministry. Yet later, James becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church and ultimately died for his faith. What changed? The earliest sources give a simple answer. He believed he encountered the risen Jesus. Then there's Paul. Paul wasn't merely unconvinced, he actively persecuted Christians. Yet suddenly he becomes Christianity's most influential missionary. He abandoned status, privilege, and security. He embraces suffering and hardship. What best explains such a radical transformation? Well, Paul gives an answer. He encountered the risen Christ. Fact 5, the resurrection message appears immediately. One of the strongest pieces of evidence is often overlooked. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul quotes an early Christian creed. Christ died for our sins. He was buried. He was raised on the 3rd day. He appeared to witnesses. Many scholars date this creed to within just a few years of Jesus' death. Even the most skeptical, hardened, atheistic scholars don't date this too far away from Jesus' crucifixion. Christianity didn't gradually evolve into resurrection belief. It began with resurrection belief. And then there's some more evidence that most people sort of miss along the way. I think some things that are overlooked. The women witnesses. All 4 Gospels identify women as the first witnesses of the empty tomb. This detail is significant. In first century Jewish society, women generally held a lower legal status as witnesses than men. If someone were inventing a story to persuade a skeptical audience, women would be a surprising choice for primary witnesses. The presence of women in these accounts suggests that the authors were just reporting what they believed actually happened rather than inventing a more persuasive story that they could. There's also the explosion of the church in Jerusalem. Christianity didn't begin in a distant city decades later. It begins in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus was executed, the very city where hostile authorities lived, the very city where witnesses could challenge the claims. This is the last place a fabricated resurrection story should have succeeded, yet it spread rapidly. Why? Well, because something convinced thousands of people that Jesus was alive. Now let's look at why do alternative explanations fail. When we look at what is the most plausible explanation, every historical event requires an explanation. So if Jesus didn't rise, what would best explain the evidence? Well, there's the theory that the disciples stole the body. Why would frightened followers invent a resurrection? What would they gain? Not wealth, not power, not comfort, not prestige. Instead, they gained persecution. A conspiracy theory fails to explain their willingness to suffer for what they proclaim. How about the swoon theory? Claims that Jesus never died. It requires us to believe that a severely beaten and crucified man survived Roman execution. He escaped burial and convinced followers that he had conquered death. I think such a figure would probably have inspired pity, not worship. About hallucinations. Hallucinations do occur, but hallucinations don't explain an empty tomb because they don't explain group appearances. They don't explain multiple appearances across different settings. They don't explain James. They don't explain Paul. How about legend development? Legends require time and distance. The resurrection claim had neither. The proclamation appears immediately. The witnesses were alive. The opponents were present. Jerusalem was available for verification. The timeline is simply too short for legendary development to adequately explain the evidence. We also have to look at the transformation of Jewish belief. This is one of the strongest arguments that's often overlooked. First century Jews believed in resurrection. They did believe that, but not this kind of resurrection. They expected a general resurrection at the end of history. They didn't expect a man to rise in the middle of history. Likewise, Jews expected a victorious Messiah. A crucified Messiah is a contradiction. Yet suddenly, thousands of Jews began proclaiming exactly that, a crucified Messiah, a risen Messiah, a divine Messiah. This wasn't just an adjustment to Jewish theology. It was a revolution. What caused that? Well, the earliest Christians gave the same answer, that Jesus rose from the dead. The resurrection explains, or best explains, the dramatic transformation far better than any other competing theory. Let's look at the fact that the resurrection validates Jesus' claims. He claimed authority that no ordinary teacher could claim. He forgave sins. He had unique authority over judgment. He spoke and acted with divine authority. He predicted his own resurrection. If Jesus remained dead, then all those claims collapse. But if he rose, everything changes. The resurrection is God's public vindication of Jesus. It's heaven's declaration that Jesus is exactly who he claimed to be. The resurrection is not merely evidence that a miracle occurred. It's evidence about who Jesus actually is. So why does every apologetic argument ultimately point to the resurrection? This is why the resurrection remains the centerpiece of Christian apologetics. Cosmological arguments may point to a creator. Moral arguments may point to a moral lawgiver. And fine-tuning arguments may point to intelligence behind the universe. But none of those arguments tell us that Jesus is Lord. It's the resurrection that does. The resurrection bridges the gap between abstract theism and Christianity. It connects God to Christ. It connects philosophy to history. It connects evidence to faith. That's why the apostles focused on it relentlessly. Read the sermons in Acts. Again and again and again, the message is the same. God raised him from the dead. That was the center of apostolic preaching. Not abstract philosophy, a historical event. So what does the resurrection mean for us personally? Well, it's not merely an intellectual argument. It's profoundly personal. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, then death is not the end. Evil doesn't ultimately win. Suffering's not meaningless. Hope's not wishful thinking. The earliest Christians endured persecution because they were convinced that death itself had been defeated. Their confidence was not rooted in optimism. It was rooted in what they believe happened in history. The resurrection gave them courage because it changed their understanding of reality itself. And it offers the same hope today. If Christ is risen, then forgiveness is real. Redemption is real. Eternal life is real. And no grave has the final word. The resurrection is not simply the foundation of Christian apologetics. It's the foundation of Christian hope. Now what I want to do here is I've got 3 videos that I want to show you. They take some familiar stories that you may be aware of. And I'm hoping that what they'll do is they'll give you a little bit different lens through even seeing those stories and reading scriptures. And as the disciples walked with Jesus to Emmaus, we're told that Jesus taught them about himself out of the Old Testament. It's about a 2.5-hour walk, by the way. I always asked my hermeneutics class when I would teach, can anybody get up and tell me about Jesus out of the Old Testament for 2 hours and 30 minutes? I never had one student raise their hand. And here's the sad thing. If Jesus could do it, and we're learning in seminaries anything other than how Jesus is in the Old Testament, we don't have the same hermeneutic that Jesus did. So let's look at how maybe some of those stories might have gone. Guys, got first video, play it for us.
There's a famous story in the Bible about a father named Abraham who had a beloved son named Isaac. One day, God gave a terrifying command. Abraham would have to sacrifice his son. How could God command a father to sacrifice his own son? The answer is profound. For 3 long days of travel, Abraham was filled with grief for his son. Then on the 3rd day, they came to a hill in the land of Moriah. Abraham put the wood for the sacrifice on Isaac's back, and he watched in sorrow as his beloved son carried the wood for his own sacrifice up the hill. On top of the hill, Abraham explained that Isaac was the sacrifice that day. In obedience to his father's will, Isaac lay down on the wood to receive the deadly piercing of the knife. But at the last moment, God spared Isaac from death. God provided a ram caught by the horns in a thorn bush as a substitute sacrifice in Isaac's place. Isaac was delivered from death on the 3rd day. So then, why did God give Abraham that terrifying command? You see, like Abraham, God had a beloved son named Jesus. And one day, God would have to sacrifice his son. Jesus came to a hill called Golgotha, the same place where Abraham took Isaac. And God watched in sorrow as his beloved son carried the wood of his own sacrifice on his back up the hill. In obedience to his father's will, Jesus lay down on the wooden cross to receive the deadly piercing of the nails. But while God had spared Isaac, he did not spare his own son. Jesus was the Lamb of God, crowned with thorns, who was sacrificed in our place. Yet in the end, like Isaac, God delivered Jesus from death on the 3rd day. So you see, God's command had a wonderful purpose after all. God wanted Abraham and all of us to understand how deeply he loves us. And how much does our Heavenly Father love us? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him might not perish, but have everlasting life.
I want you to listen to these stories that you've heard all of your life, and I want you to see that the resurrection is all through the Old Testament. Let's play the next video.
The Bible tells us about a young man named Joseph, who was the beloved son of his father, Jacob. Jacob loved Joseph so much that he gave him a special coat of many colors. But this made Joseph's brothers jealous, so jealous they wanted to kill him. One brother, whose name was Judah, or Judas in Greek, convinced the others to sell Joseph into slavery in Egypt for 20 pieces of silver. After he was taken down to Egypt, Joseph was falsely accused and condemned to an underground dungeon where prisoners often awaited death. There, the innocent Joseph found himself between 2 criminals with 2 different destinies: Pharaoh's baker and cupbearer, the stewards of the bread and the wine. When asked to interpret their dreams, Joseph explained they would each meet their different destinies after 3 days. The baker would be hanged on a tree, while after 3 days, the cupbearer would be raised to the right hand of the king. And Joseph, in between the stewards of the bread and the wine, said, "Remember me." In the end, Pharaoh learned Joseph could interpret dreams. Joseph was raised up from the dungeon and ascended to the right hand of the king. From there, he arranged to give life-giving bread to all the nations during a great famine. Does this story sound familiar? Like Joseph, Jesus was the beloved son of his father, but his Israelite brothers grew jealous of him, especially Judas. Like Joseph's brother Judah, he sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. At the Last Supper, with the bread and the wine, Jesus said, "Remember me." After that, Jesus was falsely accused and condemned to death on the cross, where he found himself between 2 criminals with 2 different destinies. But in the end, like Joseph, Jesus was raised from the grave and ascended to the right hand of the king. His heavenly Father gave him a throne surrounded by a rainbow of many colors, and from there, Jesus offers the bread of life freely to anyone among the nations who simply asks him.
And then one final story that I think everybody knows fairly well, and it might really change your mind on some things. Let's roll the third one.
The Bible tells the story of a man named Daniel. He had a remarkable spirit. And so, King Darius planned to exalt him above all his other officials. But the officials grew jealous, and they conspired against Daniel. They convinced King Darius to sign a decree. No one could worship anyone except a king under penalty of death. On the first day the king's decree was signed, Daniel prayed to the Lord 3 times facing Jerusalem, as was his custom. From the moment he prayed, he came under the king's decree of death. On the second day, Daniel's accusers charged him before King Darius. The king knew Daniel was innocent and tried to find a way to save Daniel, but he could not. That evening, Daniel was thrown into a pit of lions. A stone was rolled over the opening of the pit and sealed with the seals of the king's officials. But very early in the morning of the 3rd day, King Darius ran in haste to the pit and discovered Daniel was alive. Daniel reported that God sent the angel of the Lord to deliver him from death. Immediately, King Darius gave orders. The seals were broken, the stone was rolled away, and Daniel was raised up from the pit of death. Afterwards, Daniel ascended to the right hand of the king, where he ruled over the king's worldwide empire. And the king sent messengers throughout his kingdom with letters commanding everyone to worship the living God who delivered Daniel from death. Does this story sound familiar? Like Daniel, Jesus had a remarkable spirit, and the Lord planned to exalt him above all others. But this made the religious leaders in the temple jealous, and they conspired against Jesus. Like Daniel, Jesus prayed 3 times facing Jerusalem on the night he was betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. After that, Jesus' accusers charged him before Pilate. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent and tried to find a way to save Jesus, but he could not. Jesus was crucified and buried in a tomb. A stone was rolled over the opening of the tomb and sealed with the seals of Pilate's officials. But very early in the morning of the 3rd day, the women went in haste to the tomb and discovered Jesus was alive. God had sent an angel to deliver Jesus from death. The seals were broken, the stone was rolled away, and Jesus was raised from the grave. Afterwards, Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Lord, where he rules over all the world. And the Lord sent his apostles throughout the earth with gospel letters inviting everyone to worship the living God who has the power to deliver us from death.
As those disciples walked with Jesus to Emmaus, they finally recognized who he was. And it's interesting because in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, there are 3 verbs that are used in the fall: took, gave, and ate. She took the fruit, she gave it to her husband, and they ate. What was the result? Their eyes were opened. At the house of the Emmaus disciples, Jesus took the bread. He gave it to them. They ate, and their eyes were open. Maybe, just maybe, Dr. Luke, after telling us Jesus talked about himself from the Old Testament, wants to add one more thing. The verbs of our fall, took, gave, and ate, they become the verbs of our restoration because their eyes were open too. They saw the risen Jesus. And that's why 2,000 years later, the most important question any person can ask remains the same. Did God raise Jesus from the dead? Because if he did, everything changes. Thank you.